Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
This week marks Juneteenth Day. It was a moment in 1865 when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas to inform the state that slavery had been abolished. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In the 1930s, a former slave recounted that moment as part of a New Deal project. And he said, quote, "The end of the war, it come just like that. Like you snap your fingers. Everyone was singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Everybody went wild. We was free just like that. We was free." And the celebration was born out of that moment in Texas, known as Juneteenth, when the slaves, the last of them, were informed of their freedom. But even as they celebrated, dark clouds were gathering to impose another form of subjugation, that is, Jim Crow. It would take the civil rights movements and black activism of the era to remind us of what was promised in that moment. In our studio this morning is Muneen Jackson. She is a former member of the Eastern Town Council as well as a longtime activist in Talbot County. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So recount to me what you think is the significance of Juneteenth. Obviously, it was celebrated right after the Civil War in many communities, but then it seemed to fade and did not really come back until maybe the 1960s, and sort of a look back in fresh eyes in terms of the experience.
Well, for me, I'd have to go back to 1963. I was quite young then, but I did board a bus from Stanton, Virginia to Washington to be there when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, and all who had gathered around who were part of what I hoped was a continued movement for equality and justice in this country. It didn't happen that way, and it hasn't happened that way. And although I celebrate Juneteenth, in fact, I'm going to announce and make sure that the credit is given. I brought Juneteenth to Talbot County and also to the Gene Jackson Park, I think it's called, here in Salisbury, with the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And before the Eastern Town Council, we asked them to participate. This was on May 17, 2004. Right. I was on the council then, and the members of the Kwanzaa Foundation, Isis Drake Wilson, and the Banneker Douglas Museum, Lamar Wilson, and this one woman who was participating in what was called Fred's Army then, Carol Minerick, came before the council and talked about the importance of this cultural revolution. But for me, it was more than a cultural revolution. The idea was to make sure that the progeny of the slaves understood their strength, their resolve, and to celebrate those who had lived through such a horrendous time, and then those who didn't make it, but who sacrificed, whose lives are sacrificed in the eventual freedom, I would say, in quotes, of their brethren. So I have mixed feelings about it, although I like I said, I do celebrate it, and I do encourage the celebration of Juneteenth. I'm hoping it will become a national holiday because it's important for us to be reminded from time to time of the shoulders on which we stand, the bridges that brought us across. And so Juneteenth is one of those types of celebrations that can remind us of that. However, it also places a responsibility. Legacy is very important, but it also has a responsibility attached to it, and that is to continue to grow to maintain the dignity and resolve of your ancestry, to participate meaningfully in the society in which you live in a positive way, to take stands that are important, even if you're standing alone for those things which are right. So that is what Juneteenth means to me, and it's an opportunity for those around the country to sort of say in one breath, in one chorus, in one in unison, as it were, that we are a product of a brave and resilient people. On the other hand, it's important that we understand that Juneteenth didn't bring about the freedom. As you said in your introduction, Jim Crow followed, and there's been years and years of all kinds of disappointing, as opposed, and devastating handling of human beings that look like me.
Well, as a matter of fact, you mentioned that, and one of the quotes I ran across, actually, Abraham Lincoln, who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he wrote to Horace Greeley, he said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery." So his motivation for freeing the slaves was mixed in terms of what he was willing to do.
It was economic. Mm-hmm. Period. At the end of that, I mean, that's as far as I'm concerned. He didn't have any real interest as the president of all of the people. I'd never thought he saw us as people necessarily, and so his objective was the economic stability of the country. Although the signing of this proclamation did create within the country a belief, a thought, that movement was being made towards the freedoms that all other people were enjoying. Well, white people were enjoying,
right.
Because
or maybe white males. It makes you that matter.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Let's not forget that one, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I don't spend a lot of time bashing Abraham Lincoln, but I think he gets far too much credit for the reality of the freedoms that were eventually given to African American people. Harriet Tubman, I just want to.
Sure, go ahead.
Was interestingly enough, Sojourner Truth asked her to go to see President Lincoln and she decided not to. She said if he had listened to me a long time ago and allowed the enslaved humans to fight in the war would have been over long ago. And so anyway, she said it's going to be over. This is true. She had a dream of premonition about it, and that the end of slavery was coming. She was in New York at the time, and at the home of Garnett, and said, "Oh, okay, we don't have to worry about it now. It's going to be over." So they thought she was a little off. But as it happened, and my point in saying that is that not to take anything, to take some things away from Abraham Lincoln, but to give him his due. He did do what the masses of people seemed to need in order for them to march forward for the freedoms of other people. But there was a higher power, I believe.
Well, one of the things, as a matter of fact, and reminded me of something the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was obviously talking about reparations, but he said, "I don't understand what that has to do with us." That is, those people were born long afterwards. But it does seem to me that slavery created a relationship between one socially defined group as opposed to another. They are socially defined. There's nothing inherent about them. And that even though slavery ends, that relationship doesn't alter except in its manifestation, i.e., it ultimately winds up being Jim Crow. I mean, that's a relation that just underlies everything.
Well, Mitch McConnell leaves a lot to be desired in his adjudication of issues and facts. However, the benefits of slavery, the who picked the cotton, and how did cotton, make for a robust economy, and how did that robust economy lead to the wealth of people like McConnell or his ancestors. So, obviously the benefits that were derived from the free labor of enslaved human beings has lasted for hundreds of years. So for him not to see that he's a beneficiary of the enslavement of my people by his people is rather ludicrous. I mean, but I guess he's trying to say that there's no money. there's no money that he's willing to give, and it's not necessarily money. But everything has a financial.
But do you think it's just a failure, whether it's intentionally or not, but a failure to recognize that legacy still has this impact? It's still being felt today? I mean, you have polls that indicating there was like a large swath of like people who are white who think that everything's now fine, or they're concerned about, quote, reverse discrimination, that kind of thing. That there's this sense that, well, now it's been so many years since the civil rights movement, it's been so many years since slavery and Jim Crow, that now we're okay.
Well, I think people are so confused, in this world today. There's so much starvation in this country, black and white, and it's the wealthiest country, in the world. And so my hunger and your hunger, it's all the same hunger, but I'm trying to understand it from a perspective from an historical perspective. Mine has gone on far longer because of the color of my skin. Yours may have gone on because you're elected, and that's how we look at it. So, because if you've been free and white all your life, you should have been able to do A, B, C, and D. Now, that might sound very simplistic, but it's really how many African Americans feel about the situation. I don't know. I think that most of us who are thinking people realize that there's a genesis for everything. And so if there's a genesis for it, then you have to be willing to look at that. What caused these things to happen? And then you may want to say, as in the case of reparations, well, we didn't give you the 40 acres and a mule. Can we do that now? I don't know. I think that greater minds than mine will sit around and ponder what is feasible and what isn't. But was that a debt that was owed? And the fact is, yes. If I don't pay my debts now, just any of us, there are consequences. So you didn't pay your debt. It doesn't mean that it was forgiven. It means you didn't pay it. And there's interest that has accrued. And so when are you going to pay this? And how will it be resolved? And is it important for the United States government to look into how we can pay this debt, or to at least make some kind of approximation, to making those people that they have crushed under their feet whole. And so does that mean better health care? Does it mean free education or more education? Does it mean a check that's going to be written to descendants of slaves? I don't know all the answers, but I do know that there needs to be an answer so that there can be some satisfaction of the soul, some satisfaction of the mind, some coming together of the hearts of people. Because when you wound somebody and you just put a Band-Aid over the wound and you keep on stepping, the wound is still there. So you have to find some healing agent so that at some point in time, I don't know if I'll see it, but it would be certainly lovely to contemplate that people would be able to get along in a way that is respectful of each person's humanity.
Well, as a matter of fact, do you think that there's a certain illusion in the sense that we obviously elected our first African American president, which certainly was a great stride forward. On the other hand, 2 years later, we saw certainly a backlash, and I would look at it as a racially tinged backlash, at least, to his ascendance. Do you think that we were fooled by the idea that, well, now we've overcome to a certain extent, or, I mean...
Well, I don't think electing a qualified person is any answer to the debt that was owed.
Right.
Be he black, white, or grizzly gray.
Right.
I'm sorry about that. That is just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And now, but to the other part of the question, I was one of these people who campaigned very fervently. I went to 9 states by myself. Because I believed that it could happen. Many people didn't believe that it could happen, and I had an interesting tone on my phone that said some things like that. So for me, it was a time that had come, but I didn't think that it answered the President Obama's ascendancy, and the First Lady being an African American woman in the White House, built by slaves.
True.
Was an answer to the historic discrimination. I thought it was a wonderful pause in the history of this country, and it was an opportunity for some kind of reconciliation. But the time passed so quickly, it seemed, and we got out of step. So whatever the bringing of a president and an African American president to the White House could have done, should have done, was marred by the Mitch McConnells of the world and the Donald Trumps of the world and those they represent, because they don't operate in a vacuum. There are a whole bunch of people who look like them, who feel the same way that they do, and probably don't understand why they have to give up whatever their love is, their statutes or their way of life or their hopes for themselves. Because see, most of those people who follow Trump and who follow McConnell are just as marginalized as some of the other people in this country. And they are not going to gain wealth either, but they don't understand that suppose they united with other people, black people and yellow people and red. Suppose they united, maybe their lives would be a little bit better. But so much obfuscation, you know what I mean? You can't see the forest for the trees. So anyway, I don't know if I got off topic, but I just get so a little frustrated when people say or mention or suggest that having President Obama was the end all and be all of discrimination, and then answered some that he's entitled. He's entitled as a qualified American to be elected. And so what did that do for African Americans? That's for another story. I'm not for another time when we talk. But because I'm now if he had nominated an African American woman for the Supreme Court, then I would have said
then you'd be okay, right?
But since he didn't.
Right.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you this.
Sure.
So in terms of what we're seeing, and Trump is actually in some ways integral, because he raised the issue about the birther issue and so on, which seemed he rode his sort of way into the nomination with that in terms certainly of his political awareness for the population. What we're seeing now with Trump and some of the racially tinged stuff with Trump, is that something that you think is growing in this country, or do you think that this is a segment of the population who may feel this way, who is actually diminishing in time, because we have efforts, for instance, to suppress votes and things like that, right? Are we seeing sort of the last, I don't know whether they're last gasp, but that has always been there, and we're just seeing something that's a little more visible, but is also maybe dying in the process?
Okay, now your question was not so clear.
Is this a temporary? Is this something that was always there, and we're just happen to see it to come to the surface? And is the kind of racism that we see that might be that's reflected in this, is it something that is ultimately disappearing? It's just so bright right now to our own eyes.
Well, I think Trump could not have succeeded in his efforts to become president if the underlying racism wasn't so prevalent, and if he couldn't maintain his hold, and he could not be so free to do whatever he wants to do unless he had a strong underpinning. And I think that he does. I think that there are people both educated, when I say educated, I'm talking about who are schooled, and those who are not, who support his theory of life. Of course, that vacillates. I mean, his theory is not not set in stone, but
Right.
the one that deals with white supremacy. You know, I think that there is a strong, unrelenting segment of the population that is fueling his objective. I just do. And I think that it had died out some because there wasn't a voice to give the so-called credibility to it, a voice to give to the public to know that there is this underpinning. I mean, he has folks marching, giving all kinds of credibility to his very existence. They don't care what he's saying. They just care that he is representing a segment of the population, a thought process that would marginalize other people.
Let me ask you this: do you find any optimism in the idea that there are a couple of things? One is that we're also actually having a hearing on reparations, that we see a number of Confederate statues and memorabilia and flags come down, that we saw, in fact, a very sharp pushback on Charlottesville and the president's comments, or ambiguous comments at best, that there is something else going on that is at least gives you more optimism about where the country's going.
Well, I don't think you can fall downhill but so far. No.
Well, that may be true.
Yeah, so at some point, I think there is going to be an ethical compass and a shift in morality, because you can't stay angry all the time. You can't fight every day. And so eventually, I think, I don't know when that'll be, but eventually I believe that people will come to a meeting of the minds, which really says we all can coexist. I'm not a pessimist by nature, but I have lost some optimism because we're fighting the same battle. As I said, I was 15 when I went to D.C., but even before that, I was a young person. I come from the kind of family that's all been involved in civic duties and that kind of thing. And I've always felt very much equal to anybody. And I felt, that I have strengths and weaknesses, and I appreciate all of that in everybody else. And so I started out with this starry-eyed idealism that was how I would be able to negotiate life. But as it turns out, it's not the case. You have to remind yourself daily that you can do it. Of course, I believe in God, so so I do it with that grace.
Right.
But your question probably, I'm starting with my own question,
Yeah,
not making sure
that's all right.
I understand yours, but but I believe that
I mean, there's all these things I would have thought even 10 years ago I would not see.
well, that's what I'm saying, and we're going over the same. And
You
I'm
know,
tired. We're going over the same road again, except that even in the case of reparations, it's not the first time that it's
right.
been brought to the attention of the public, but this is the first time that the congressional representatives have taken hold of it. I do hope that they will bring in the works of Queen Mother Moore. That's another story, but she was a long time ago. She's passed now, but who talked about reparations. And Dr. Claude Anderson right now, who was very, very a bright man. He worked in Carter administration, but he did some other things. But my point is, what I'm hoping for is not just a group of people who will intellectualize. There are some people who have studied and suggested actual things that can be done, that would be satisfying as far as reparations are concerned. So if that happens, I tell you, I believe that there will be a healing in this world because I go back to what I said before. When you have a wound and it's still there, you need to address that. Once that's addressed, I just believe that once that is addressed, then we can all have a sigh of relief. We can go on to part two.
Well, speaking of healing wounds, here in the state of Maryland, there's been, I guess, legislation authorizing for truth and reconciliation when it comes to lynchings. What do you make of that, and what do you think might come out of it? I mean, obviously here, for instance, on the Eastern Shore, we have both the lynchings in Salisbury as well as Princess Anne, which I've talked to a number of people about. But does that move us forward any? What do you think will come out of that?
That's a very difficult topic for me.
Yeah?
Yeah, and to talk about reconciliation, I'm not there yet. I'll be perfectly frank. I think that it's time for the state of Maryland and any of the other parts of the country to come to grips with the fact that they hung people who look like me. And these truth and reconciliation activities, some people think that they are very helpful. I'm not there yet. Mm-hmm. That might sound very... I just have a problem with there not being any justice for those people who were killed, who were murdered. Now, once you hold somebody accountable, then we can talk.
Do you think that's possible to this far out? Even though it's not all that far out. I mean, we have people who obviously certainly had family members who perhaps were involved.
Yeah. Well, I guess the only thing I can say is that if there were an effort made, I would be satisfied. I want to find some of these folks who committed these atrocities. I want to have a conversation, even if some of them may have passed on, I don't know. But what I do know is that Black people are always asked to forgive. I get a little sick of that.
I understand that,
yeah.
Yes.
So let me hear you say you're sorry. Let me hear you, what kind of penance is that? Because I do want somebody to do some time.
Right.
I think that we're not honest about our feelings. These are emotional things, but they're very real. Somebody's family was devastated as a result of their people being strange fruit.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there, and we'll probably have more conversations about this. We've been speaking with Mooneen Jackson. She's a former member of the Easton Town Council, also a longtime activist in Talbot County. I appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Well,
morning.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.